Now, another thing that, has been following the Overwatch League, and in that essence, I think it's almost a little unique to Overwatch in terms of how one evaluates the success of the team in terms of how much expected return you are getting from this. Now, this offseason, I suppose, like, at least through rumors, we've heard that at least lower ranking teams are willing to spend a little bit more, assuming that probably the return of investment they thought they could be improving upon. Some other organizations are spending big time, especially also those that had generally mediocre results. But it also feels that it is not a first order effect. It's probably not a second order effect. I'm not sure if third or fourth is applicable here, because theoretically the geolocation which you're sitting in, the social media game you're running, the brands that you have on your team, those might be bigger things than winning the league, are they not?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ways to unpack that question, right? So think about, and let's start with, like, if you were a bottom tier team during the 2021 season, it's not hard to justify. I apologize, I don't know how many games Valiant or London won off the top, but it was like one or two, right, or something.
Valiant 0, London 1.
Valiant 0. Okay, exactly. So to go to your, to as a board or as an executive of a company, right, to say, like, hey guys, like, probably winning one game in a league that we're participating in is, like, not a great look for our franchise and is hurting franchise value, is a pretty easy statement to make, right? To say, like, hey, like, turns out we spent the minimum, so what, 55 or whatever it was times 6 or 7, whatever the min was. Like, I need an extra, like, $300,000 or $400,000 to, like, try to be like 18th or 15th, right? And just not be last or 19th. Like, that is a really, I don't want to say it's an easy, kind of thing to say, but it is a compelling argument to make to a group of individuals running your company, right? It is it's a logical train of thought. And so I think that's where, again, like, there's no context around, and I appreciate what Halo does. I think leaks are, fans need them. Like, we understand why that stuff happens, but there's no context around, like, what does spending a little bit more mean, or like what does spending or giving out real offers mean. There's no context around, like, does that mean instead of offering, like, the min, like, they offered like a 60K contract and they offered everyone 60K contracts? Like, does that mean they offered everyone 100K contracts? Do they offer everyone 200K contract? Right? Like, there's no and look, obviously I'm poking fun a little bit, but, like, there's no context around what does that additional spend look like or mean, right? But I think from a logic standpoint, the argument about, hey, we only won one game, we won 0 games, we're going into Overwatch 2, it's an exciting time, it's an inflection point for the league, let's spend a little bit more to not be in the absolute basement, it makes a lot of sense, right? And I think if I was at any of those franchises, I would make a similar argument, right? Conversely, to the other side of the table, if you're, one of the higher spending teams, or you're a team that, generally is equipped for success, and maybe didn't have the best season in 2021, saying let's break the bank on 2021, and you get all top players, like, let's really spend to win, I personally think is a harder argument. But, like, everyone's opinion on that is different, right? There are distinctly folks across the league who are really bullish on Overwatch 2, right? They just can't, they just believe in it. They think it's, going to be, revolutionary or whatnot. And so if you believe that, kind of in your core being, that this is the moment to spend, sure, it makes sense thinking you can, so long as you believe you can monetize that, right? Saying that I'm going to go drive another 500 or $1 million in sponsorship revenue because brands want to pick the winning team in Overwatch 2, right? Like, that could be a real thesis that some of these top spending teams, kind of have in mind, and if they're equipped to do so, like, kudos to them, right? Like, it's obviously an incredible feat anytime you're able to spend to be a great team and win, and then also monetize it through sponsorship or events or merchandise or whatnot, right? That's that's kind of the dream of a of your business model if you can make it happen. I think the middle area is what you kind of talked about a little bit in terms of like sponsors have varying degree and brands have varying degrees of how much they value winning, right? It's a lot of these and a kind of a core premise of this geo-located league is that brands want to work with their hometown team, right? And so you know, and look, I'm not saying that brands will just give their hometown team money if they're the last team in the league every single season, right? Like, no brand really wants to be associated with that. But like the argument that you can drive, significantly incremental sponsorship dollars off of, being eighth versus 12th versus 14th, like that's where it gets a little murky, right? And that's where I think each organization kind of has to look internally and say, do we have a sales staff that like needs those extra wins? And how much do those extra wins cost, right? So I think that's where the equation gets really difficult because in a year where you do have a lot of teams breaking the bank, potentially or theoretically, you each of those incremental wins costs you a lot more, right? So, instead of a kind of in an average year, if everyone's kind of, just, doing the average and you have, a few teams spending, a few teams not spending, and everyone's in the middle, maybe those incremental wins cost you, 200,000 or 400,000 or 600,000. And you can monetize that, right? You can say like, okay, like I'm going to go sell one 200K sponsorship that offsets, kind of the 200K that I'm spending to be eighth instead of 10th, right? And if you can do that, like that's kind of an easy way to look at it for that year. But in a year where everyone's kind of spending and a lot of teams decide they want to spend to win, maybe those two extra placements cost you 400,000 and you think you can only sell one 200K deal, right? Now you're looking at, do I value those two wins and everything that comes alongside them at $200,000? And the answer is I don't know, right? That's the personal decision, and not personal, but that's like the group decision or the company decision that I think a lot of teams have, go through and that they look at. And obviously you add in then kind of all the other unknowns about a new game, new format, whatever it looks like for 2022, and you're like, wow, like I don't know if those two wins are worth whatever it's going to cost in a year where a lot of teams want to spend.
Is it okay? I'm going to ask a little bit of an unfair question, but then I'm going to qualify it in a sense because I think in terms of because we're a franchise league in Overwatch, there's no relegation and whatnot, so there's less risk of just being truly awful, but it seems to be to a certain degree it was even rewarded. Now, here's the unfair question. What do you think is easier to sell? This year's, to sponsors that is, this year's success story of the Shanghai Dragons or season 1 where they were by far the worst team, didn't win a single game, got onto ESPN as like the biggest like worst sports team of all time? What do you think? Like, Is there something to be said about being truly awful and therefore getting a lot of attention because of that, because of the story that develops there?
No. So yeah, being truly awful is not more monetizable than being a championship team. And if I alluded to that in any way, that was not the point, right? So the point is that if you're a championship level team, you have to think about how much did that championship cost you, right? And so like was the delta for Shanghai, right? Was it $2 million? And did they make that up in terms of the press, the prize pool, the sponsorships that they sold against it? Like that's the question that they have to kind of ask themselves and that fans need to kind of think about, where it's like, was it worth it based on what they spent, right? And like that's a really hard equation when like a lot of the salary information is not public, right? There's not public salaries for players. There's not a players association. It's very and this is where I think there's so much of that disconnect where like and I love kind of how Aaron and Supreme and a lot of the GMs on the league kind of have to handle this. Like they take the brunt of it from the community, right? In terms of they don't understand why their team isn't winning, right? And they don't understand like why their team isn't getting the players that make the most sense, or why didn't you get Charong? Why didn't you get Pelican? Why didn't you get Yaki or Decay? Right? Like, and a lot of the times the answer is because like it didn't fit with like the objectives that the team had, right? In terms of like, we want to be 12th place and we want to spend this. Like, we want to be 8th place and we want to spend this, right? Like, I think the term like what fumbling the bag gets thrown around like way too loosely. It's not that teams are like not thinking about this, right? And it's not that like it's not that there's not like a group decision kind of to make a lot of these moves. It's just that fans don't have, and the community doesn't have the context around like what teams are doing, and it's very hard. Like, it's hard, I think, for a team to come out and say, hey guys, like, we want to be 15th this year, right? Like, no team is gonna like outwardly come on your show, or go on a stream and just say like, hey, that's what we're doing, right? And there's creative ways to do it, right? Like, we're rebuilding, we're focusing on investing in younger talent, like we're waiting and seeing a little bit. I think we're kind of we kind of need to find a better middle ground where like the community reads a little bit between the lines more about like what teams are doing, and they appreciate that there are team staff leading these organizations who are having to kind of work within the confines of what they're given, and at the same time, like, we all need to do better about sharing what context we can with the community about like where our franchises are heading, and like how we're thinking about 2022 and future seasons.
Thinking about 2022, I think one of the contexts now, I guess fans can also sort of contextualize part of the decision. But if you guys met your expectations, I guess that means you weren't so dissatisfied as maybe some fans, at least the vocal ones, seem to be, with potentially like making as few changes, I would say, in your coaching staff as you did. And namely, you held on to your head coach, Sup7eme. So can you give further context why that decision was made this offseason?
Yeah, and this is an interesting one that I haven't seen that much of, but yeah, I mean, I think we were very public that Aaron and Sup7eme were signed to 2-year contracts, right? So it was announced when we made those decisions. I think it was back in 2020, right? For fans out there, part of it is that the individual roles that folks play on teams is not always outwardly facing, right? We're never going to tweet like, oh, like a player came here because I think you were asking earlier about, players coming to join organizations because of certain players being on the roster, right? Like, yes, that happens. Is it the best practice? Probably not, right? Because when a player leaves, then like you have an unhappy player, right? Like it kind of spirals from there. Right? Same way in the NBA, right? Like, it's generally not a great thing to do, even though teams sometimes kind of bite the bullet to do it. But for coaches, right? Like, Sup7eme and Aaron, in terms of like meeting our objectives as an organization, did a great job last year, right? For the 2021 season. For the role that Sup7eme fills, like, head coaches across the league all do different things, right? There's coaches who are strategic. There are coaches, Deepe was the GM and head coach for a little bit, right? The job titles in esports are so gray in terms of like, what is this person actually doing, right? And for Sup7eme, he is like the emotional glue that holds our team together, right? He's the one that takes a lot of these young players. He molds them into successful. I don't want to say he molds them to adults, but like he does. He integrates them into how do you behave as an Overwatch League player that is competing in a professional league with very with high stakes, and is representing a team, right? And so, like, if you ask me, like, is Sup7eme like the strategic mastermind of the Justice? Like, the answer is no, right? But does he have a ton of value in what he brings in terms of keeping the roster together, bringing up rising talent, molding them into successful people and players, recruiting that talent, and honestly, playing a large role in kind of getting players kind of into this system, and getting them to DC. All those answers are yes, right? And look, we're obviously not in a position to make promises on whether or not that is the successful model of coaching for every organization, right? Like every team is different, right? Like for us, we felt it was really important to have someone in that role. Tidal obviously has joined us this offseason, more focused kind of on the strategic side of things with Chihuahua, right? So now, historically we've kind of had this model where it was, one strategic coach, one individual coach, kind of the role that Hawkery was filling, and then Supreme kind of keeping it all together. This year we've kind of doubled down strategically, right? And part of that thinking is that, Overwatch 2 is going to have a lot of new things that you're going to have to figure out, right? You're going to have new heroes, theoretically, new maps, changes to heroes, changes, right? Like a lot of the strategy for a brand new game is going to, there's a real competitive edge if you can figure that out first, right? And so that's a lot of our thinking there. But yeah, I coming into this, I wasn't actually aware that there were a lot of comments questioning why why Supreme was coming back. I thought it was kind of known, right? Obviously, Aaron and Supreme are, kind of they were part of building this core, back particularly around the end of the 2020 year. So but yeah, hopefully that gives a little bit of context around that.
Right. And I mean, you have made augmentations to your roster. I mean, you brought on Happy, Vigilante, and Krillin. Are those like these cost-effective mid-range talents that the Justice is going for?
Yeah, I think, we obviously aren't going to discuss the individual salaries that our players get paid. I think that, that's just a competitive best practice across the board. But yeah, I think, when you look at, our roster and we're not done, right? I think the nice thing, and I think it is public, right, that, teams have kind of until January to have, I think the core 6 or whatnot players, right? And, we don't know when exactly the season starts or whenever it was, tweeted. I forget what John said publicly, but there's time, right? And so, Aaron and Supreme and our coaches they're still running tryouts. We're kind of in a nice spot where, we have this core. If something kind of presents itself, we get more information about Overwatch 2, something changes, we have room to still make a few additions or changes. So look, the roster's not set in stone, and I think we will kind of continue our thesis, from an organizational perspective, like we want to build cost effective team that ultimately finds some level of success. Maybe it's not pushing for a championship until kind of that ROI becomes known or clearer for Overwatch 2 in the 2022 season. And ultimately, we want to take care of our players, right? So we will continue investing and kind of giving them this quality of life, kind of set up here in DC, and ultimately, helping them evolve and ultimately turn into great ambassadors for the game.
Right. Now, theoretically speaking, I mean, it's hard to predict if every player will transition well into Overwatch 2. With a contract structure, as with the addition, I think it was in Season 3, where you could negotiate like a minimum contract length down to, I believe, 30 days. Theoretically speaking, if you wanted to be super cost effective, you could just say, okay, you're getting this 30 days, you're not transitioning well into Overwatch, we're cutting you, and therefore getting a new player that proved to be more transitioning better into Overwatch 2. Is this a strategy that you're looking to?
Well, look, obviously we hope it works out. It's good, like we don't want to get on Overwatch 2 and find out none of our players adapted well. Like that obviously would not be a good outcome. But yeah, I think we can talk a little bit about those contract changes. When I joined the Overwatch League, it was the end of the Justice's first year in the league. I had no idea that was that the previous rule existed in terms of if you wanted to cut a player, you had to buy them out of their whole remaining contract. And I'm not saying I inherited the worst setup in the league, but it wasn't a good setup in terms of the contracts that we had left, and it wasn't a pleasant thing to kind of walk into and find out, like, to fix it, like, it's going to cost a lot of money, right? Like that was not something that I thought of, was in existence when I took the job. obviously things have changed. I think it's a fairly positive change for the league, right? You can't have players riding the bench, just, kind of holding you hostage. Like, there needed to be some sort of middle ground where like teams can effectively make changes to their rosters. Players obviously receive compensation so that they're not like, signing with a team and then walking away with nothing. But like there needed to be that kind of middle ground, right? And so, look, obviously we reserve the rights to try to do, if we need to do that. I don't think I don't think Aaron would shy away from doing it, but it is certainly not the strategy that, or hope that our players don't adapt to Overwatch 2 and all of a sudden like we, and if you think about it on the kind of logistical side of it, right? Like it is cash, right? Like it's real cash. Like 30 days isn't nothing. And then it's also the cash about, getting a new player and getting them in, right? Like it's a new visa, it's a new flight, back and forth, unless, they're already in the US or whatnot. Like it's not nothing. And so I think, I don't want to say the community sometimes thinks that like teams can be like kind of flippant with like doing it, but like it's certainly not an easy, and there is the PR side too, right? Like you don't want to be known for churning through players or whatnot. So it's certainly not an easy decision. It's not a hope that we have, but obviously, I think net over net, it's kind of a positive mechanic that was introduced to the league.
Right. Now, as a last question, you already said you aren't done. You're currently sitting at 7 players. How many do you think you will need? How many news can Justice fans expect in the short term? Or are those more long-term goals when we go towards the season in April?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's a secret, right? We do need a main support, we think. I think we don't know what Overwatch 2 will look like, but hypothetically, we do at least need a main support, right? So I think that's a safe bet for Justice fans. Obviously, that's something that we need to figure out and find. Outside of that, I kind of default to Aaron and Supreme a little bit on like, it's up to them at the end of the day. Like it is a long off season period, and I don't feel bad saying, I don't watch every scrim or tryout that, it's not my core responsibility, but um, you know, they're the ones who ultimately can kind of give some context on like, maybe there will be more moves and whatnot. So we'll wait and see. But I think no matter what, for Justice fans, right? Like I think it was important to kind of be here, and one of the core kind of reasons for it was let's just set expectations together for all your favorite teams, right? Like let's remove Justice from the equation and pretend I'm just some guy talking to everyone. Like please do try to think about what your favorite team is doing before you get mad at them, right? Before you get mad at them for not spending and breaking the bank to win a championship, before you get mad at them for going Western instead of being mixed or all Korean, like just think about like all of the extra, kind of unknowns that teams are navigating. And at the end of the day, like remember, like these are businesses, right? Too, that, we need money and cash to be able to operate, right? And like we need to be able to show a return and to be able to monetize so that we can continue operating, producing great content, signing your favorite players and putting on this league, right? That we all obviously want to, see be successful for the next 10 or 15 years or whatnot. So I would just, hope that folks kind of try to keep a little perspective as we all kind of navigate this long off season and what I'm sure will be an interesting start to 2022.
Right. Now, reading a little bit of the subtext, I suppose, you said that you were leaving it down to Pre to make those decisions and Supreme. Does that imply that you're currently not trying to find budget for a player that you're currently negotiating with?
I mean, if they're negotiating with a player, they haven't told me yet. So,
right.
That's a safe,
Fair.
that's a safe reading between the tea leaves, I guess. But no, I think they're, they keep me updated, every day. Like we all have these conversations, and it really is a group decision, right? In terms of signing players or not. And our thankfully, our we have probably one of the most involved ownerships in terms of Mark and his board, and they work very closely. They I think we'd struggle to find an owner that ultimately wants to understand the moves that his competitive team is making, just as much. Obviously there are others, but he does a great job in that regard. So yeah, I think look, if there's a player that we're negotiating with, I haven't heard about it yet, but I'm sure I will shortly if they are.
Then we thank you for a very insightful interview, especially about the financials of the Overwatch League, and wish you the best of luck for the rest of the offseason.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And obviously, folks, I'm always happy to field questions. So hopefully we do this again, sometime through 2022.
Sweet. Thank you.